Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I'm a little off my game this morning, but I think it's just incipient dread at next week's pharma conference in New York City. I've got like 20 meetings lined up. Most of them are in hospitality suites at these hotels in Midtown, but some of them are just in hotel lobbies with companies that didn't book suites. And I've already turned down a couple of breakfast and lunch meeting invites because I just don't want to be in a public setting without mask too long. But the lobby meetings may necessitate that. And since everyone there is going to be coming from somewhere else, I am not super optimistic I'm going to come out of next week with my COVIDginity intact, you know. But outside of waking up at like 3 a.m. today, I have been doing great over the past week. So let's get past all that and dive into this week's show. Now, my guest this time is Della Subin, author of the wonderful new book, Accidental Gods, On Men Unwittingly Turned Divine, from Metropolitan Books. This is nonfiction. I loved Accidental Gods. I was pretty sure I was going to from the first review I read of it. I saw a blurb for it in Airmail, the Graydon Carter email magazine thing, and I thought, that sounds interesting. Read the review, plots, reached out to Anna, ordered the book myself. It's fantastic. This book, Anna explores the phenomenon of people who get, well, deified by people in other parts of the world. Like the way Haile Selassie in Ethiopia became a god figure in Jamaica's Rastafarian religion, even though he had no interaction with them and had no idea this was happening, hence the unwittingly part. Or like the way Prince Philip became an object of prophecy in Vanuatu, or the way the explorers / conquerors, Columbus and Cortez and Captain Cook, were perceived by the people whose lands they invaded, where they weren't necessarily thinking they were going to be treated like gods, but were turned into various, well, divine forms. And there are a lot of other examples she brings in too that are complicated. It's a really, really fascinating book. And all the while, Anna offers these subtle reminders that we're not exactly in a privileged position ourselves, given the myths and deifications that are harbored or take place in America and the UK and elsewhere. I mean, it's really a fascinating book because she doesn't take any sort of condescending approach to quote unquote primitive people regarding, white conquerors. It's much more subtle what she does in terms of exploring the cultures of those various regions and how the interaction with, for the most part, white Europe and America affected both worlds. And in the process, she explores like the Western invention of what we call religion, the modern version of what religion is, and the way religions cultures got flattened out into certain denominations for the sake of colonial need. And she gets into the faults and flaws of the rationalist project and just the bizarre revelations that have resulted from like a half millennium of war, colonization, and oppression, and the reaction to all of those factors. In a sense, it kind of reminds me of that Louis Menand book I read last year for our podcast, The Free World, especially the sections on anti-colonialism and the intellectual and popular movements that resulted from it. I am not doing Accidental Gods justice. I'm sorry. I'm afraid I am kind of punchy, as I mentioned in the intro. This book is absolutely riveting. I could not put it down. A couple of hundred pages just burned through it over like 3 or 4 days because I was so compelled. Anna's prose is just fantastic. And the stories she relates and the analysis that she brings to them. And as we talk about, it's not in academic jargonese. There's no hyper-trans postmodernism. It's all language that, you know, a regular reader is going to get. But like I say, everything she brings to it, the stories, the analysis, etc., it's all top notch. It's a really fantastic book to read. And I'm awfully glad I got to talk to Anna about it, what spurred it, and what might be coming next for her. Anyway, let's get to the show. Here's Anna's bio from the book. Anna Della Subin is a writer, critic, and independent scholar born in New York. Her essays have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Harper's, the New York Times, and the London Review of Books. A senior editor at Bidun, she studied the history of religion at Harvard Divinity School. Accidental Gods is her first book. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Anna Della Subin. Tell me about the origin or origins of Accidental Gods. Where did it begin for you?
Absolutely. So I had the idea over a decade ago. I had just graduated from Harvard Divinity School, where I was really steeped in kind of ancient ideas of divinity, reading the works of a lot of the Desert Fathers and Indian philosophy. And then when I graduated, I took a job at Bidun magazine, which is a cultural magazine of the Middle East and its diaspora. And so it was totally different from the kind of Harvard world I'd been in. And not long after the uprisings of the Arab Spring broke out, and we decided to pick up the entire office and move to Cairo, just off of Tahrir Square, to cover what was happening in a way that the mainstream media, you know, wasn't speaking to. And so we were plunged into this moment of kind of pure political ecstasy after the fall of Mubarak. And so I was thinking a lot about autocrats and what drives people to act politically, how ideas catch fire. And I had this sort of strange thought, well, what happens if you have too much soft power, too much charismatic authority? Well, you might just find yourself mistaken for a god, like Haile Selassie and the Rastafarians. And I couldn't stop thinking about this idea that a politician on one side of the world could become a god on the other side without ever consenting to it or agreeing or even knowing about it. And so I started searching for more examples of this and kind of found these accidental gods everywhere. And I pitched the idea to my colleagues at Bidun magazine. And one of them said, "Oh, that's an amazing idea. Who should we commission to write it?" And I immediately bristled at this idea because, you know, I was dying to write about it. But my colleague said, no, the sign of a great editor is that you give all of your best ideas away. And so
you said, I'm a terrible editor.
maybe I'm not meant to be an editor. But I think I finally convinced him that I was the best person to write this piece. So it actually, Accidental Gods, had its first incarnation as a piece for Bidun magazine. And then a few different avatars appeared, one in the London Review of Books about Prince Philip, and it kind of began to magnify from there into a book eventually.
Yeah, what was that moment where you realized this is bigger than a series of you know, smaller articles, that there was not just a common thread, but that there was going to be enough material to really bring this into full book form?
Yeah, I think right away I was, you know, just overwhelmed by how many stories of unwitting deification I was finding. I kind of I I decided very early on that I had to confront the most uncomfortable, ugliest part of the subject, and that's the trope of the white explorer who's hailed as God by the so-called savages of the New World. So those are the myths of Columbus and Hernan Cortez and Pizarro and Captain Cook. And so those weren't in my very first piece, but I knew I had to confront, this whole genre of stories. So I wrote. In the beginning, I was really conceiving of the book as being a book of essays, and so I actually wrote the book backwards. So White Gods, which is now the kind of last third of my book, I actually wrote it first, kind of a long essay about these myths of white explorers, and the birth of race in the New World. And that, once I had written that, it was kind of very clear that it was a book, and that was what formed my kind of the basis of my proposal. And then it entered sort of the standard channels of book publishing, and but it took me a very long time to get to that point. I'd already been working on it for 6 or 7 years. So.
Yeah, I thought it was a fascinating, I don't want to say choice, but it was an interesting way to start, having the first chapter about Haile Selassie, going with a person of color, even though he didn't necessarily consider himself of color, being considered a god halfway around the world, when, so much of the other instances are more, as you put it, that the savages and the white god and the great white explorer and all that. It was kind of neat to start off with that instead, and show this phenomenon, especially as a 20th century phenomenon, instead of going back to almost pre-Enlightenment times. That wasn't actually a question, but I thought it was a neat way to start out the book. Was there a go on?
It's nice to hear that, because it was a kind of controversial decision to structure the book that way, I guess. But across the book, I'm showing how deification has been used both as a means of liberation, often in context of imperialism, colonial conquest, but it's also been a means of oppression. So deification has kind of worked in these very, very opposing ways. And so a more common way to have told this history would have been to start at the beginning with Christopher Columbus, and then, I go all the way up to Trump. So there, I think, readers might have been expecting a chronological account. But I worried that if I started with these myths of white explorers, which in the book I'm tearing them apart, so I'm showing how they often hinged on problems of language and how they were used to legitimize conquest, and the conversions of people in the New World. But I worried that if I started there, then all these other traditions of unexpected apotheoses, like Haile Selassie and the Rastafarians, would somehow seem kind of suspect. It would be harder to kind of enter into those universes after, I've torn apart the idea of apotheosis. So I start with Haile Selassie, and, just the really powerful theology and poetry and prophecy that the early founders of the religion created around him. That was deeply paradoxical in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think it was a good choice. I mean, you could, starting with the going in the other direction, going chronologically, it could have, people could have said after 1/3, oh, yeah, no, I get what this book is about, and just, not bother with the rest of it, not realizing how rich and strange this whole phenomenon is. So, I commend your editor,
Mm-hmm.
good way to start it off instead. But how did the book change for you over the course of the research and the writing? Where did it spin out of, anything you had expected in terms of what you were writing?
So I never would have expected that researching this book would have led me to the invention of religion itself as a modern concept. But I was, there's the middle section of my book looks at these stories of imperial British officers in the British Raj who are worshipped at tomb shrines in India, often with libations of gin and cigars. And these stories kind of get endlessly recounted. And I was really surprised to find these stories of deification present in the canonical texts of the 19th century scholarly study of religion. So this is in the work of theorists such as Max Mueller and E.B. Tyler, who really forged our modern concept of religion as we understand it today. And these stories were used in a very deeply pernicious way to kind of paint the religions of peoples in the East as, being fanatical and irrational and in need of further colonial rule. And this is at the very moment when words like Hinduism itself are coming into use and being forged in these imperialist contexts. And so I hadn't anticipated that I would go so deep into the idea of what is a religion itself, what makes a religion. And so that, I guess, this kind of sense of discovery for myself really, really kept me going in writing it for a decade.
Was there a sense of, they didn't teach us that at Harvard? Did you come at it feeling cheated at all about your education? Or is it just something you really had to dive deeper into?
Yeah, it's funny. There was a reviewer in book form who also went to Harvard Divinity School, and he wrote a really great piece, I thought. But he described it as Divinity School in pill form. And I thought, actually when I was there, which was 10 years ago, we weren't tearing apart the concept of religion in the same way as people are doing now. I think things have kind of gone in an interesting direction since I left Harvard, but it was quite funny to think of it in that way.
You become the 201 level course. Yeah. What led you to to Divinity School?
So I would say it's my path towards Divinity School probably started in childhood. I grew up in the cracks between religions, never one thing, never another. I was sent to an Episcopalian school, and everyone would take communion, and I would just be kind of stuck in the pew, like wondering what the body of God tasted like. Just kind of wanting to participate and wishing I had that kind of tradition for myself. And so I've always just been fascinated by religion and ideas of the sacred. And I studied philosophy in college and Latin and Greek, which kind of led me to study Sanskrit in Divinity School. And I kind of, took off from there.
So I guess the overarching question, it's one you bring up in a chapter about a friend of yours who was unwittingly turned divine. What is sacred?
That's an amazing question.
Way too broad, I know, but still, I thought we could start with something all encompassing like that.
Well, I think what I'm trying to capture in the book is the fact that the sacred is always all around us at any moment, and it takes an infinite number of different forms for different people, but it's always there for you. So at moments, across the book, many of these stories happen at moments of loss or upheaval or intense struggle, or moments where it's just hard to imagine any other kind of future ahead. And so that's when the sacred really steps in. I think there are an infinite number of ways to describe this thing that's, this kind of transcendence that's around us. And it seeps into everything. So our politics, our economy, our language. What do you think the sacred is?
Well, that's one of the super questions of the whole shebang. And it's something I'll say wrestled with along those lines, that sense of, I don't want to say everyday magic, but the mundane, all the miracles that happen on a day-to-day basis that we don't consider miracle by any, Catholic or Vatican like criteria, but yeah, that sense of creating something. And again, you go into the reductionist binaries of Enlightenment thinking and how we turn, the rest of the world into, well, we try and reduce it to terms we can grasp, I guess, like using animism as opposed to really understanding. It's like a line you had in I think the chapter on Prince Philip, where an anthropologist is trying to get the stories and understand what the myths are, and doesn't get why they're changing as he keeps asking, the people these sorts of questions. And one of them finally tells him, "You don't know how our stories are." And that sense that we just don't understand, for one thing, when it's a different, I don't want to say race, just a different, group of people living in another world, but that sense that it becomes the personal also. We don't understand one another's stories. We all make things divine in certain ways. It's something that to me was an undercurrent that I was probably bringing to your book, but that sense in which we deify certain aspects of our own lives and the people and the things within them, where we try and, portray ourselves as utterly rational and, or at least, in some sort of Western spirit. Once again, not a question, but an observation about the book and what I think you were approaching with it, and why I found it so fascinating.
Yeah, that image you invoke is kind of a stone being thrown into water, and it creates kind of these rings and ripples that magnify further outward and outward. And they're saying, stories are kind of like that. You throw a stone and then it kind of spreads in these waves. And these stories of deification are really like that. And I guess, yeah, for me, something that was so important was how to write other people's stories, how to write about all of these different ideas from contexts and traditions so different from my own. And I really felt this kind of strong responsibility just to try to make it as beautiful as I could, just to kind of create through my writing a sort of suspension of disbelief. So when you enter into the book, there is a quality to it that I hope to have conveyed of a sort of more mythic plane. And the style of the book has been kind of a bit polarized in how it's been received, which has been interesting to see. But, for me, I just wanted to capture just the power and beauty of these ideas. And I made a lot of authorial decisions, such as I very rarely try to avoid using the word believe, like to say so-and-so believed this or they believed that, because I take issue with the idea of belief, because I don't think we can ever truly know what somebody else believes. We can know what they say, or
You're speaking my language. This is especially the previous administration, when people would say, I can't believe he actually believes blah, blah, blah. He doesn't believe anything. He said certain things, but belief means something very, very different. So,
exactly. Yeah. And so, there was like one review of my book said that, that I was a cop-out because I never actually addressed the question of, do people really believe in these accidental gods? So for instance, like, do Prince Philip's worshippers on Tanna and Vanuatu actually believe that Prince Philip is God? And for me to try to interrogate that, it's a project kind of like, throwing like a witch into water to see if she'll float or sink, or like people get burnt at the stake for, these same sort of interrogations of belief. And so there was no way that that was just, not my project in this book.
And I think it gets at that same reduction idea that, if we're spending all our time trying to, parse what's, what means something by our spectrum or our prism, that's not how they were seeing the world. And, we're trying to impose a certain way of seeing upon them. But yeah, I thought it was fascinating, and I picked up on it early on. Your word choices that didn't preclude what was happening and what was, related to the reader, I guess.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Editors freak out about that at all, or did they pretty much get it when you? Did you have to fight for it a lot or a little?
I did have to fight quite a bit because editors often, want to put in a lot of like words like claimed, like so-and-so claimed.
Contended.
Or, yeah. Or casting, questioning, what's real, what's not. But the whole point of the book is, I'm interested in why we have so many stories and myths of people who have been unwittingly turned into gods. Why do all these narratives exist? What if, how have they been used? How have they been abused? I'm not there to kind of evaluate the truth claims of them. So I did have to battle a little bit also to keep things on the mythic plane. Sometimes my editor would kind of want to draw it down a bit to earth, which was, important as well.
Of course. Were there gods who didn't make the cut?
Oh, yes, there were so many.
All I was thinking is that there's got to be a bunch that she couldn't fit in here, either not enough documentation, not enough room, but, is there one that you're just bummed out you didn't get to include?
So there's a really interesting Vietnamese tradition called Cao Dai, which has incorporated Victor Hugo into its pantheon.
I think I heard about that somewhere. Yeah. Gosh, I can't remember where.
Pretty well known. I recently heard that Winston Churchill was also in the pantheon at one point, but I don't know too much about that. But, Victor Hugo was very into conducting seances, and in one of his conversations with the dead, he kind of prophesied this new religion. And then for certain Vietnamese political activists against French colonization, kind of read in Hugo's words a prophecy of a new religion in Vietnam, which they founded. And then they started communicating with Hugo from the dead. So it's kind of this cycle of seances. And the conversations are just, kind of these really beautiful literary artifacts. And I was, of course, desperate to include it. But then I realized that it also kind of it works well with my kind of next project, which is around conversations that take place in the afterlife. So I was okay with saving Hugo.
do you see this as your beat going forward? God, religion, and talking with the dead.
I'm doing an interesting collaboration right now with this artist Agnieszka Koront, her work is kind of around ideas of political fictions, and she creates really amazing installations, and we're creating a visual mapping of all of the gods in the book, as well as all the gods that didn't make it into the book. So I created this database for her, so I'm still looking for more accidental gods.
And I'm envisioning it as an NCAA tournament where it's all these, gods going head to head till they get to the finals. But that's just me and my dumb American way of seeing things, I guess.
Battle for the godhead.
Yeah, somebody's got to come out on top, and it's the round of 64. But it'd be kind of nuts. But talk a little about the as you were talking about the sense of a religion that is, trying to overcome the political world around it. You talk about mythopolitics. You have a chapter with that heading. Talk a little about the concept of mythopolitics and what it means right up through our current day as you bring it to in the course of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So mythopolitics is a word that isn't in any dictionary yet. But for me, I think it captures so well this idea that all of politics is kind of deeply driven by mythological thinking. It kind of conjures these ideas of political theology, which people like Carl Schmitt made famous, that all political ideas are sacred ideas transformed into new forms. And I think, mythopolitics is always around us. And, most visibly, I think, in QAnon at the moment, and the deification of Trump. QAnon is often called a conspiracy theory, which I don't really think captures its power. I think it really is a mythology, because it kind of offers this theory of everything that, can both explain anything away and points the way towards a transformed future. And so I see mythopolitics all around us, the footage of the invasion of the Capitol on January 6th, the QAnon shaman and his horns, all of that. And so I hope it's a word that comes into greater use.
That moment where you'll be deified in the Oxford English Dictionary. That'll be
yeah. And I think, I think the Democratic Party would do well to draw more upon these currents of mythopolitics. It seems to be like the right is kind of more powerfully charged by these ideas. And it's a formidable power. It's harnessed.
It feels like, I'll say we did in the Obama era. There was a sense of Obama as superhero, which, had its critiques, of course, but, maybe it's that sense of critique that differentiates the two parties quite that much. Self-critique, I guess. But.
Yeah, I never found any apotheoses of Obama or Biden.
Yeah, Biden, not so much. I think people see him as a guy, but yeah, that's a lot different than, the whole Trump worship that takes place. But
yeah.
A question I had, I didn't know about your time in Cairo during the Arab Spring. Also, I don't want to sound too jaded, but how long did the optimism last from the time you were there? Or was there already a sense, as Mubarak was being overthrown, that this was all going to go sideways?
Yeah, so when I was there, there was really a genuine euphoria. It was just really amazing to experience that kind of optimism. It
Yeah.
was very short-lived, it was only a few months, and then things things took even darker turns. But it was contagious, and I would say that it really much helped to spark the uprisings of Occupy Wall Street, which followed only a few months later. And so just like being there was really transformative for me, just in the kind of participating in this political moment. And we were just, talking to anyone who would talk to us. We set up our headquarters at this gallery called the Townhouse Gallery. And yeah, we just kind of, I went in a lot of like strange directions, like posing as an American tourist in the Egyptian Museum to kind of find out what had happened to looted relics during the uprisings and things like that.
Had you been an activist previously? Had you considered yourself an activist?
Yeah, in my way, I think, but I think my writing is how I express myself, and it is deeply political in its own style. I think a lot of what I can bring to the table is kind of I read a huge amount of scholarship, like scholarly texts, anthropology, history of religion, and I kind of feel like I'm a translator in some regards of just ideas that are circulating in academia that aren't really crossing over into kind of non-ivory tower settings.
As someone who went to a very left-wing college in the late 80s and early 90s, yeah, I get where you're coming from.
I'm very at home with being around academics, but not being institutionalized myself.
Yeah, I think you mention your bio mentions, let's see, about you being a independent scholar. Is that I'd say, point of pride along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know. I had originally really wanted to do a doctorate in religion, but even in the application, I couldn't figure out which box to put myself in. And so I put that aside. And then I lived in Oxford for 6 years, which is, really like the heart of academe. And I did most of the research for my book in the Bodleian Library, which was, kind of the heart of scholarly empire. A lot of the original diaries and journals of British colonial officers are there in the library. And I was using the special collections and kind of roaming freely without any affiliations. And so that kind of sense of freedom was really important for me. And to be able to write or speak in a voice that was not academic, was crucial. I don't think I could have really written this book as an academic book.
Yeah. No, you could have, but you'd get no reviews and be a university press and, just put something on the CV.
Put a lot of claimed and caveats.
Contended. You do have the one footnote in the entire book that, it raises the question that I guess we have to get to. How do you kill a god?
Yes. If not by bludgeoning him.
Captain Cook saw it, in a not so good way, but yeah, what is that process like? That sense of the de-deification or the just deicide that takes place.
Yeah.
How do you see it play out across different cultures?
It's quite funny. I recently ended up in the British tabloid, the Daily Mail, for canceling Captain Cook.
God.
Because an excerpt from the Captain Cook chapter was in the.
And you'd say, no, the Hawaiians actually canceled them, but that's neither here nor there.
I love this idea that it's so easy to just cancel Captain Cook. Maybe this is actually working as a means of deicide. But yeah, rewriting history. I think all of the campaigns like Rhodes Must Fall and, all of these falling idols of slaveholders and colonizers and all of this is, it is kind of chipping away at the Godhead.
Yeah, it was, again, not that he was deified, but when I went to college, I was next door to Amherst College, and the movement there, very early 90s, was the realization that Jeffrey Amherst was the guy who came up with the idea of infecting blankets with smallpox and giving them to the local Native Americans. And why do we not change the name of the school? This is, you're celebrating genocide every time you say his name. I'm like, yeah, there's problematic, and then there's genocide problematic, and that is pretty bad, but it never led to anything along those lines. But
I wonder if that will kind of come into the public conscience again.
It's a weird thing. It didn't really in that run of statues getting overthrown and tossed into the harbors in various cities. But it reminded me again, 1990, 91. That was an issue, and things are different now, I guess, with mass media or social media culture being able to spread the word in a different way than when there were different gatekeepers in the past.
Yeah, it's been quite amazing to me because I wrote White Gods, most of it I wrote in 2015. So that was even before Trump's presidency. And I had this kind of part about statues of, great white gods. And I had this line that said, white gods will fall like raindrops. It feels like the heavens are about to open up. And then like 5 years later, suddenly all these statues of white gods are falling. And I'm like,
I was onto something.
A little prophetic line in there.
Yeah, to feel pretty good. But again, the book is about those, not just about the repeating patterns like that, but that also the sense that, quote unquote, we think we're the advanced ones. And yet, there's, as you show, numerous instances of that sort of deification within, we'll say, Western culture or white culture, especially when it comes to the question of whether God is a white supremacist or not, as you bring the whole book to a head in that last few chapters.
Yeah. So I'm showing how, these currents of deification were all deeply implicated in them. And these ideas, especially of white gods. So, of the myths of Columbus, Cortez, Captain Cook, how they've really pervaded the archive of white supremacist thought up till the present day. You kind of, if you go on white supremacist internet forums, you see references to these myths as showing that they're proof that the Americas should belong to the white race alone, because the people of the New World hailed white explorers as gods. And there's this idea that in the book I describe as white divinity, which is kind of, I find the phrase white privilege to be a little bit trite. I think white divinity really captures the this, deep, pernicious idea that the white race is innately transcendent in some way. And there's a long history of white supremacist thought about, who's human and who's more than human and who's less than human. And all of that is in the background of, of life today. And so in the book, I'm kind of trying to just give another language to speak of it, and just to kind of capture it in a way that, gets beyond the conversations about like white privilege, for example. There's been, a huge genre of books about that, but I think white divinity is a really interesting way to approach it.
Yeah, it puts me in mind, and the book did at various moments, especially early on, about the Hereros in Southwest Africa. It's not in the book, but it reminded me of at least Thomas Pynchon's representation of the Hereros who were massacred by German soldiers in the turn of the last century, and as a result started dressing and mimicking the Germans, both the men and the women, and just having these huge rites and rituals where they would act as though they were and the Germans had no idea what to make of it. They couldn't figure out if they were being respected, ridiculed, having a curse cast on them. It was completely inexplicable to them that the people they were literally just wiping off the face of the earth were trying to or acting as though they were now the Germans in the in their world. It was exceedingly strange. And it reminded me when you had the section on cargo cults and the sort of Western understanding of that, or lack of understanding of it, the way these myths and rituals arise and how they're not as mappable as we think they should be, I guess.
That sounds very much like a kind of constellation of movements that I'm describing in the chapter on spirit possession. Where you have all these different groups, such as the Hauka in Niger, who at the earlier part of the 20th century kind of were possessing the spirits of the French colonial officers around them. And there's one story I tell about this officer called Horace Crochichia, and he tries to suppress the movement of the Hauka and jails the adherents who are kind of creating these kind of counter societies of spirit possessed kind of French officers. And then when he tries to imprison them, his own spirit becomes incarnated into the pantheon and manifests in the bodies of the prisoners, and then leads them to break out of jail. So he becomes kind of divinely doubled in this way that he begins to act in a way that's completely against his own agenda. And this new spirit is born called Crocisia or Corsasi, and the spirit keeps appearing across the history of Hauka, which spreads into Ghana and the Ivory Coast. And the Hauka is only one of a number of different movements that possess the spirits of colonial officers, including the Tsar in the Sudan and Egypt. And it's spirit possession is particularly interesting to me. It's kind of the most like physical and visceral and uncomfortable of all the ways you can be turned into a god. It's kind of funny because as I was doing the edits on the book, I'm describing the symptoms of spirit possession, like how if you've been possessed by a spirit. And the symptoms are nausea, insomnia, stomach cramps. And I was pregnant at the time, and I thought, oh, this is actually exactly like pregnancy. And the more I thought about it, it made perfect sense. Spirit possession is really similar to pregnancy. In a lot of ways, you're living with this whole other spirit inside of you. I've never seen anyone write about that, but it's funny how your life kind of seeps into things that aren't about you at all.
Speaking of giving birth, seeing your first book in print, that vibe of, holy crap, I actually made this, getting to see it the first time when it came out of the publisher's box.
Yeah. It's funny, having the book come out has really changed my life, but not in a way you would think. So
how so?
So for a decade, I was working on this book, and something that kind of terrified me on a daily basis was when I would meet strangers and they'd ask me like, oh, what do you do? What are you working on? And I'd have to say, well, I'm writing a book about people who've been turned into gods accidentally or unwittingly. And people just looked at me like I was crazy. Like the idea, or just like sometimes people would get it, but often they wouldn't. And I kind of lived in dread of having to explain myself. But I'm not a good enough liar to have come up with another alibi book that I was reading. And so even more than the book appearing as a physical object, what's quite amazing is to suddenly have the idea make perfect sense. So it's really been received like people are like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense as a subject for a book, Why has
that was my moment. Oh, and I saw the review in Airmail on a Saturday morning. I was like, oh my, this is obviously, I need to sit down with a person who had the idea to do this book, because this is just the greatest idea in the world. So
oh, thank you. See, that's amazing to hear, but for like a decade,
I can imagine.
Just got a lot of really strange looks, including extended family members. Nobody quite knew what I was up to. So now at least I have a physical object.
Yeah, I did this. Yeah. Now, if it's too personal a question, I just say so. But any family members who were a little religious and put off by what you were working on?
Not.
And if they're going to hear it, you can say, Gil, I don't want to talk about it, but that's fine. I'll edit that part.
No, I think, that not really. I guess what happened to me over the course of writing the book on the personal level was that my mother got very ill. She had an extremely harrowing medical crisis. And she came back from the brink of death, and she quite literally resurrected. And it was, it was just like, I had to take a year off from working on the book really when all of this was happening, but watching her resurrect, I could kind of, I've been seeped in these ideas of, just transcendence, and watching a person come back to life like that really brought home kind of these sort of all these stories of the miraculous that are in my book. Like I literally lived it in a way with her. And so, yeah, so that,
And you double that with becoming a mother at the same time. I don't mean it in a funny way, but I mean, you really, you're seeing childbirth, motherhood, and resurrection over the course of working on this project, which again makes me worried about what you're going to discover with the next book. But.
It was quite funny because I was very heavily pregnant when Prince Philip died. And I was watching his funeral on my laptop, and I had the laptop like pressed up against my belly, and I got a bit worried about soul transfer or reincarnation of Philip into the body of my unborn son.
Who will end up making, horribly racist comments, ostensibly off the cuff, but we knew they were playing.
Yeah. So far, there are no signs that Philip has reincarnated as my son, but
just keep your fingers crossed and keep hoping. But
remains to be seen.
When I mentioned next book, though, you alluded to something about conversations in the afterlife. Is there, never to jinx an author, because I know you guys really, and this is something you'll learn now that you've got your first book out. Nobody likes talking about their second book because, it could all go off the rails. But tell me about what you're working on.
Yeah, so I'm working on 2 books right now. And so one of them is an essay collection, which kind of draws on an earlier project of mine, which is this little paperback book that I did with Triple Canopy called Not Dead But Sleeping. Speaking of resurrection, it's all about the myth of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, which is a story about 7 Christian youths who are fleeing the persecution of a Roman emperor, and they escape into a cave, and then they sleep for 300 years, and they wake up into a transformed future. And this story enters the Quran, and then it becomes this kind of powerful driving metaphor for a lot of different groups at times of political awakenings, groups who see themselves as the 7 sleepers, from Ataturk's revolution in Turkey up to the Arab Spring, especially in Tunisia. And so I wrote this short book, but then I kept coming across more and more new incarnations of this story, whether it's from an Iranian blogger who was in prison, or a sheikh in Bay Ridge who is using the story to think about climate change and how to survive it. So I decided that I would keep updating this essay kind of every few years, just forever, for the rest of my life, to kind of just keep adding to it. I love the idea of literary projects that don't have a clear ending, or, that can kind of keep growing with you. And so I've been working on that. And then I'm also really interested, as we mentioned earlier, about conversations in the afterlife. So there's this really rich archive of writings, which are often known as spiritualist thought, which are the transcripts of seances. The Accidental Gods actually ends in a seance in New Orleans, when a lot of the characters in the book actually come back from the dead to speak to this Afro-Creole society at the time of the Civil War and the Reconstruction. So figures like the Emperor Moctezuma and Confucius and the mystic Swedenborg. And I'm really interested in these texts, like what are conversations that you have in the afterlife, and how are our politics in this life, how are they refracted into our views of the afterlife? Who gets let into heaven? Who gets excluded? Who ends up in hell? Like, all of these questions are deeply political. So I'm interested in looking at the afterlife, the politics of the afterlife in this essay collection. And it also just bring together a lot of the other things I've written have been around these themes of sleep, dreaming, and death. Whether it's writing about the Egyptian novelist Albert Kosari or the Moroccan writer Ahmed Bouanani. It's kind of always been a set of themes for me. So that's the direction that will go in.
Do you sleep well?
No. I'm a terrible insomniac.
Which makes sense then. You know,
yeah.
Writing about something you only wish you could get. Yeah,
I know. When I wrote about 300 years of sleep, it was deeply aspirational.
Yes, thinking of that book by, I have no idea how to pronounce her name, Otessa Mosfegh.
Oh, yeah.
Which I've presumably just mangled completely. But yeah, my year of rest and relaxation. But yeah. The other question I should ask, you've written profiles of other artists in different fields, not necessarily writing. What are you afraid of me asking? Given what you've gone through in interviewing and profiling others.
Gosh, I mean, asking me what is the sacred is a pretty...
I thought that was a good one, right?
Terrifying question.
Well, you comported yourself well with that one.
Yeah. I don't know. I think the question of why do you write is a kind of terrifying one too. But I found an easy answer to that one, which is immortality, obviously. Seeking for myself a kind of immortality and writing about deification. But yeah,
I get mine through bantering. I figure after I'm gone, somebody will stumble across the audio tapes and all this stuff, and they'll say, "Man, that guy just never let the other person talk." But anyway, sorry.
Immortality of bantering. No, you've amassed an incredible archive of conversations.
You are just about within a couple of days of being the 10-year anniversary of my first interview for the show.
Oh, wow.
I think it was like March 7th or 8th, and we're recording this a few days before that. But congratulations, because I don't have anybody else scheduled. You are close enough to being my 10th anniversary podcast.
That's amazing. But you must be on the vanguard of podcastery, Like, isn't that kind of when it began?
I'm a couple of years late for it. Like my inspiration for it was another great podcast, the one by Mark Maron called WTF, where he has conversations like this with comedians, writers, actors, etc. So he was already 100 or so episodes in when I discovered his, and then thought, I know some interesting people. I can start doing this. And, it's all been a downward spiral ever since, but, it's worked okay for me, but still it's been it's opened my life in really interesting ways, which is sort of what I wanted to, get at in relation to the profiles of other artists. What do you learn, or what have you learned, do you think, from, talking to, or, particularly writing about other artists and, profiling them and interviewing them? Are there things you've picked up on about either their version of immortality or something else?
Yeah, I guess firstly, just a kind of sense of community. Like one of the hard things about being not institutionalized in academia, but being a kind of scholar in my own way, is just not having the sort of natural communities that you fit easily into. So just kind of finding those resonances is really exciting, whether it's the artist I mentioned, Agnieszka Koront, who I'm collaborating with, or, other artists such as Ellie Ga, who I profiled for Tank in London, who has a lot of kind of shared interests with my own, just kind of carving out sort of networks of solidarity between writers and artists who are interested in myth and the sacred and history. And, there are a lot of, I guess I also, I take a sort of worshipful approach to the writers that I admire. I'm kind of deeply an enthusiast and tend to deify the people who've inspired me. So whether that's, writers such as Susan Howe or Ann Carson, or John Keane, who I know you had on the podcast, who has really been a god for me. You know, I haven't actually profiled any of them, but they've.
I can hook you up with John. I mean, that counter narratives book. Holy crap! That just.
Yeah, there's a lot of counter narratives inspired.
Yeah, that's a good throw. I hadn't thought about that. That's because I read so goddamn much for the show. I hadn't even thought about that book in particular. But at the mention of it, that's clearly running through your book so well.
It's very much there. John Keane kind of opened new doors for me for what I could do on the level of the line. I really want to send him my book. I don't know.
Like I say, I've got a connection. I'm sure you can reach out to him anyway, but he actually, well, he's over in Newark, so it's only about half an hour from here. I could actually deliver it in person, but that's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that sense. And again, I'm whatever I do is nowhere near as rigorous and as connected as yours, but that same sense of, not being affiliated and building your own community like that is I think, critically important, because so many of us aren't part of, the institutions themselves, but,
Yeah, absolutely. And even just, finding a community of people who kind of got the idea of the book and didn't look at me in a totally bewildered way. That was really important to me in sustaining it over the years. And also, it was really friends, fellow writers and scholars who pointed me towards new gods too, who would kind of, or even, pointed me towards themselves, in the case of Nathaniel Tarn, who's the one living God in my book that I go on a road trip with.
It's a great chapter. Yeah, it was, I was not surprised because the review that I read of the book, kind of primed me for how much I was going to enjoy it. But, I enjoyed the living heck out of Accidental Gods, especially that one where, by the way, did I ever tell you that I was treated as a god, with just an email showing up and,
it's the best kind of email to receive.
You can imagine, But last question.
Yeah.
Who are you reading? Which I did warn you about. It did warn you this was going to happen.
So, my reading's taken a big hit having a baby who's 9 months old. And a lot of what I read is around the books that I'm reviewing at the moment, which I can't say exactly what, but it has to do with God, not surprisingly. But I also, this week, I found time for the poetry of Imam Mersal, who is this Egyptian poet who's being translated by Robin Cresswell for FSG, and the collection is coming out in the fall, and I really admire her poetry. She kind of has this way of making these sort of quiet, very clever twists at the end of poems that make you have to go back and read them all over again and then suddenly see them differently. So I'm really looking forward to that coming out. And I've also just started the memoir of a friend of mine, who's the poet Sean Hewitt. And his book is called All Down Darkness Wide. It's this kind of almost vampiric, gothic memoir of a relationship with someone who had very deep depression, and living with that. And Hewitt kind of conjures these labyrinths and networks of queer solidarities and bloodlines in this very, very beautifully wrought way. And that's coming out in July. So I've been reading that for pleasure.
Yeah. I just looked him up, and he's 20 years younger than me. So, of course, I'm filled with hatred and rage that he's that accomplished. But that's okay.
It's also his third book.
That son of a bitch.
I know. I don't know how he does it. He would be interesting to have on the show.
This is how the show keeps going. It's always little mentions like that where I just, let me bookmark that guy and get back to this person later on. So, wow. Oh, this is fantastic. I again want to thank you. I want to thank Airmail for reviewing the book initially and turning me on to it. But I guess the real, actually, last question, which is a weird one, I admit, and maybe incredibly outside of your purview. Have you seen the movie Galaxy Quest?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay.
Tell me more.
It's basically Star Trek, where the actors discover that an alien race was accidentally receiving the TV show 20 years ago and built their entire culture and technology around the TV show, and then show up to kidnap the actors because they need their help to save the day, rescue their people. But they build an entire mythology around a bunch of actors who were, performing Star Trek 20 years ago and now are opening malls and, going to science fiction conventions. It's, not exactly your accidental God subject, but sort of, it has a very meta vibe to it while also being a very entertaining and humorous movie.
It
but
sounds
anyway,
amazing. I need to see that.
Secretly, it's the best Star Trek movie, even though it's not actually Star Trek. It's you watch and realize, if they just didn't take themselves so seriously, this would have been the movie they could have made. But
that's fantastic.
Yeah, it'll show up in the paperback version when you do your afterwards.
Yeah. Sure. Another appendix.
Oh, I love the appendix for the book. Also, it was neat seeing that sort of hidden away within it. The book's full of gems. I just want to thank you again for putting in all the work and making such an amazing thing.
Oh no, thank you so much. I'm really glad you enjoyed it, and it's so great getting to chat with you.
Thanks for coming on. Thanks for being part of the whole virtual memories experience. And if you're going to be in New York or New Jersey or, forever going to be within 50 or so miles of each other, I hope we can get together and sit down for another conversation in person next time.
Yeah, I'd love to. Absolutely. I'm definitely often back in New York, which is where I'm from. So yeah, that would be great.
I look forward to it. Anna, thanks so much for coming on.
No, thank you so much.
And that was Anna Della Subin. Her wonderful new book is Accidental Gods, On Men Unwittingly Turned Divine, from Metropolitan Books. It's available in good bookstores in the U.S. and U.K. You can find it online. It's so good. Buy it, read it. Let me know what you think of it. You can check out a lot more of Anna's journalism, profiles, and other writing and more at her site, annadellasubin.com, which is all one word, ANNADELLASUBIN.com. She's on Twitter as Anna Della, spelled the same way, and on Instagram as Accidental Gods, all one word. And there'll be links to all of that in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. Tell them there's this weekly interview podcast out there where this guy just gets these really fascinating writers and artists and translators and publishers and musicians and blah, blah, blah. We'll just say creative folk, and sits them down for conversations for an hour or so about their life and their work. And you can also support the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or music or piece of theater or art or whatever you think I should check out and turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, by Twitter DM or Instagram, I guess, or by sending me a postcard. I love getting postcards. I send them out every day now. I send one postcard every single day. That's my 2022 resolution, except for Sundays when there's no mail. Just this week, I started doing a video thing on our YouTube channel where I actually pull the card from the right now New York postcards box from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and reveal what today's postcard is going to be. They're only a minute long, so it's not like you have to make a major commitment to check them out. But anyway, that's a thing. The other thing you can do is call my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. And that goes directly to voicemail, so You don't have to worry about me picking up, getting stuck in a weird conversation, etc. Messages can be up to 3 minutes long, so if you've got a lot to say, keep that in mind. You're going to get cut off and you'll have to call back. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message on an upcoming episode of the show. I would never do that without the speaker's approval or permission. But if you leave a message and you want to say something that you want everybody else to hear, just let me know. Now, if you have money to spare, don't give it to me. I do have a Patreon. It's the same thing, VMS Pod. But while I do post there and do some exclusive stuff, I don't need the money. I'm doing just fine with my day job. The expenses for the podcast are minimal. And I really hope if you do have a little money to spare, you'll give it to people or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Tapatogo, etc. And that can be to support, their creative projects, to help them make rent, to cover medical bills. There's a lot of things that people need money for. So, I hope you'll help out if you can. When it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank. There's the Poor People's Campaign. There are freedom funds, election funds. There are various funds to help refugees regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I've also come across something where you can, quote unquote, contribute to Ukraine's defense. I don't know what that means exactly in terms of where the money goes, but if it's if it's crowdfunding weapons acquisition, it seems kind of weird to me. Anyway, you can find something. UN Refugee Committee. There are other groups out there that you can help contribute to and just try and make a better world. Okay. If you've got the opportunity and you've got a little bit to spare, give. It'll make someone else feel better. It doesn't have to make you feel better. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.